Donald Trump back at the White House tonight after a 12-day, five-nation trip covering a little over 20,000 miles. He returns as Republicans are trying to pass a tax bill before the end of the year. With time running out, Trump must decide if and when and how to weigh in on these allegations against Roy Moore. He'll face growing questions about his son's conversations that we now know about with WikiLeaks, and, of course, the continued investigation by Robert Mueller. With us to talk about all of it, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and presidential historian Jon Meacham, who also happens to be an MSNBC contributor. Jon, is there any evidence that travel will change him or his viewpoint in any way? And of that list I just read you, are there any of those items he can convert to a win with what remains in 2017?
Always possible. We live in hope. One of the things I think we're living through is a kind of test here. Because he's been away so long, he actually has played into, inadvertently perhaps, following some advice of FDR's. In the late 30s, Roosevelt said, people get tired of seeing the same name in the headlines. People get tired of hearing the same voice on the radio. The human psychology cannot continually deal with things played in the highest register, the highest note. And I think that to some extent, he actually has an opportunity here because he's been away, because there have been fewer minute-to-minute tweets.
Has there been a modern equivalent of the kind of dark presence that Steve Bannon has taken on in the role and administration of Donald Trump and the Republican Party?
In terms of an outside figure who has this kind of Svengali-like, I guess Svengali is almost too subtle an example. I can't think of someone who has managed to assert and exert this level of influence. And part of it is, in fact, he is a tribal leader. I think one of the things we're seeing in Alabama, one of the things we have been seeing the last year overall with President Trump, but particularly in the Alabama case, is the true triumph of tribal politics. If he is your guy, if he is your person, the facts don't matter. And Bannon, by shifting the attention from the substance of the allegations to the means by which they were reported, is the architect of that tribal warfare.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.
Joining me now is Joyce Vance. She's a former U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, and she's currently a visiting professor at the University of Alabama School of Law. Thank you for joining us. Let me start.
Thanks for having me.
Here, Ms. Vance, how much legal exposure does Donald Trump Jr. right now have, just based on what's out there?
So this is, I think, the first information that we've seen that would tie Trump more firmly to a potential conspiracy. But, of course, conspiracies are only illegal if they have an illegal objective. So the question is, what would these direct messages tend to prove? Would it be hacking? Would it be receipt of stolen property? Could it possibly be a conspiracy to unlawfully involve a foreign government in a U.S. election? I think that those are the possibilities that are on the table, although I don't think that there's firm evidence based just on these DMs.
Can you prove that because there was publicly, the government went public with its accusation that WikiLeaks was an arm of the Russian government, that Donald Trump Jr. then should have known immediately that it was illegal, that it was potentially he was committing a crime in his back and forth with WikiLeaks?
I think you need a little bit more than just those two facts in conjunction. But the reality is that Trump Jr. was on Twitter where this information was being widely paraded. And what's a little bit tantalizing here, Chuck, is the fact that these direct messages, they're a little bit too casual, a little bit too direct to be a first contact. And you have to wonder what other source of communication there might have been between WikiLeaks and Trump Jr. I suspect that Bob Mueller's folks know a lot more than we do, and there is likely additional information that talks about the communication that Trump had that might do a better job of establishing his knowledge of WikiLeaks' status as a cutout for the Russians.
Does it matter if technically Donald Trump Jr., and I'm just talking about in a legal sense here, is not a paid member of the campaign, is simply a family member? Can he deny that he was somehow a part of the campaign and just claim that he was a private citizen here?
I don't think that really helps him from a legal point of view. If we're talking about a conspiracy to hack, a conspiracy to receive stolen emails, or some sort of foreign interference on a campaign, none of those sorts of crimes would really turn on his status as a member of the campaign.
You were careful to use the word conspiracy. That is got a legal definition. There's really no legal definition of collusion here, is there? We use the word a lot, but is there one that you could actually prosecute on?
There's no statute that says it's illegal to collude, but I think that as we all use that word collusion, we really are talking about a conspiracy, which is just essentially two or more people either implicitly or explicitly agreeing to accomplish an illegal goal and taking an overt step in that direction.
Well, then based on what you just said, there's at least a circumstantial case that Donald Trump Jr. and Julian Assange were conspiring here.
There are a couple of details that you would need to lock down, right? Who really was on the other end of those DMs? Was it Assange or was it somebody else?
Does that matter?
You would need to nail. I think you would have to prove who he was conspiring with to make sure it was someone who was eligible. For instance, he couldn't conspire with an undercover agent working for the Bureau. So you would need to nail down details, but mostly his intent, his knowledge, his state of mind.
The idea that he was still exchanging direct messages with him into 2017 is clearly bad judgment. Is there legal exposure with that?
So bad judgment is never enough, but it might be enough to establish knowledge, or at least what prosecutors call willful blindness, which means you really knew the truth, but you were trying to pretend that you didn't. And at some point, people's efforts to distance themselves from what they know to be true become so patent that it's evidence of their knowledge and intent.
What do you feel like? What is this missing? I can tell you, the person that I am most intrigued by is whoever helped WikiLeaks curate the emails, because it clearly had to be somebody who was an American that understood each day what would hit, what would affect this media relationship and that. So that's always been a missing person that I'm curious about trying to figure out who that is. What's missing right now for you to understand this story better?
I think what's missing is what would have prompted Trump Jr. to engage in this kind of conversation. It's really interesting. Everybody knows in this sort of a campaign that the Russians they dangle, they seek to disrupt our elections and our way of life. And it was obvious that they would reach out to Trump, who was really just this candidate of chaos in this election sequence. So why doesn't Trump Jr. immediately go to law enforcement and say, listen, we're having this outreach and we know it's illegal? What led him to go forward? I think that we need to know more about that.
Is it possible that he didn't know? I mean, one of the theories out there is maybe he didn't appreciate what he was doing was, frankly, this illegal.
Right. We hear that argument that Trump was poorly served, candidate Trump was poorly served by not having professional campaign staff. And yet, during at least part of this conversation, Paul Manafort, who had experience, was on board. Other experienced people like Jeff Sessions, who testified today that he was pushing people away from Russian contact. They should have known.
All right, Joyce Vance, former U.S. Attorney in Alabama.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.
The Republican U.S. Senate nominee in Alabama's special election, Judge Roy Moore, is threatening legal action against the newspaper that printed on-the-record allegations that he molested a 14-year-old girl and pursued relationships with 3 other teenagers when he was in his 30s. Speaking to a forum last night in Huntsville, Alabama, at which media was not permitted, Moore said this.
3 days ago, the Washington Post published another attack on my character reputation in a desperate attempt to stop my political campaign. These attacks involve a minor child and are completely false and untrue, and for which they will pursue.
Moore provided no details about what type of suit he planned to file or when he planned to file it. But on Saturday, he said he will provide new information within days and denied the claim of sexual misconduct with a 14-year-old.
I've been investigated more than any other person in this country. To think that grown women would wait 40 years to come right before an election to bring charges is absolutely unbelievable. There are investigations going on. In the next few days, there will be revelations about the motivations and the content of this article. They will be brought to the public. We fully expect the people of Alabama to see through this charade.
Moore did not respond to NBC's questions when leaving his event on Saturday, but he did answer some on Sean Hannity's radio show Friday.
Would it be unusual for you as a 32-year-old guy to have dated a woman as young as 17? That would be a, 15-year difference, or a girl 18. Do you remember dating girls that young at that time?
Not generally, no. If I did, I'm not going to dispute anything, but I don't remember anything like that.
But you don't specifically remember having any girlfriend that was in her late teens even at that time?
No, I don't remember that, and I don't remember ever dating any girl without the permission of her mother.
Would it be normal behavior back in those days for you to date a girl that's 17 or 18?
No, not normal.
If my daughter is 17, my daughter's 16 years old. If she's 17 or 18, I don't want her dating a 32-year-old.
I wouldn't either.
And you can say unequivocally you never dated anybody that was in their late teens like that when you were 32?
It would have been out of my customary behavior. That's right.
Oh my. A former colleague of Moore's in the County District Attorney's Office spoke out over the weekend. Teresa Jones posted on Twitter, as a deputy DA in Gadsden when Roy Moore was there, it was common knowledge about Roy's propensity for teenage girls. I'm appalled that these women are being skewered for the truth.
Meanwhile, Moore is accusing fellow Republicans of conspiring with Democrats to smear him. Last night, the Moore campaign sent a fundraising email with the subject line, quote, McConnell's dirty plot to destroy me. Quote, according to sources, establishment Republicans are colluding with the Obama-Clinton machine behind the scenes in a desperate effort to sabotage my campaign and keep me out of Washington. But the pressure is increasing from Moore's potential future colleagues following the allegations he once engaged in inappropriate conduct with underage girls. On Saturday, Republican Senators Mike Lee of Utah and Steve Daines of Montana, who recently endorsed Moore, pulled their support. Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana also backed away in a Saturday tweet saying, quote, based on the allegations against Roy Moore, his response and what is known, I withdraw support. Tennessee Senator Bob Corker says it was a mistake to nominate Moore from the very beginning, writing on Twitter, quote, look, I'm sorry, but even before these reports surfaced, Roy Moore's nomination was a bridge too far. And yesterday, several other Republican senators suggested that Moore should end his campaign.
I don't know, Chuck. I don't know how this is going to turn out. This is just a terrible situation. Nearly 40-year-old allegation. We'll probably never know for sure exactly what happened. But from my point of view, I have to say, I think the accusations have more credibility than the denial. I think it would be best if Roy would just step aside.
Certainly, the allegations are very, very strong. The denial was not as strong as the allegations. I think if the allegations are true, there's no doubt that he should step aside, and not for the party, but for the American people. We have to find a way to restore trust and confidence in our elected officials, in our government, and this goes in the wrong direction.
On Friday, the National Republican Senatorial Committee ended its joint fundraising agreement with the Moore campaign. But as of Sunday night, the Republican National Committee continues to have 11 field operatives on the ground in Alabama helping with Moore's campaign. Nicole, I saw you had a little catch in your throat there in the middle of this story. We've been talking about this since the story first broke when I was on your show a couple days back, at the end of last week. why is it difficult for anybody at this point to do what some of these right-thinking Republicans have done and just say, we got to wash our hands of the pedophile here, or the accused pedophile, and figure out some way forward? There's no way in which the political damage from sticking with this guy is worth this Senate seat, if it's even salvageable for Roy Moore.
Okay, so here's the thing. It's not about political damage. These stories are all we're ever going to have. 4 women with nothing to gain and everything to lose, telling their story in the Washington Post attached to their name. That's it, people. There's not going to be something else. There won't be a trial, and this is not a criminal situation. He's not being convicted in a court of law. So we don't wait for a preponderance of evidence. We're not waiting for more fact. You believe the women or you don't. End of story. And Elise Jordan, for the life of me, I cannot figure out why no staffer has explained to these men who go on TV and say, I'm waiting for more information. For what? We're not convicting him. He's not going to jail. There's no due process in the court of public opinion. It's a privilege to govern under the banner as a Republican. It used to be. It's going to be a punishment in another 48 hours. But the notion that there's this construct, if true, no, this is it. This is all the information you're going to have. And 4 women under their name speaking about what have to be the most horrific moments of their lives, being fondled and touched by Roy Moore when they were teenage girls. That's it. That's all the information you're going to have.
It makes me sick to my stomach, the way that people have responded to this. It really is so chilling that the responses will make, if it's true.
It's not a trial,
and people
right.
saying 40 years, well, it was 40 years ago.
Right.
Well, who cares? That means that these women have been playing this on auto repeat every day of their lives.
That's right.
The one woman, the 14-year-old, she tried to commit suicide 2 years later. And then you have people saying, well, if these allegations are true, well, it made a big difference in that little girl's life and that woman's life.
Well, there is a solution now for the majority of Republican senators who refuse to take a real stand on this and instead choosing to say, you know, well, if this is true. But there's a solution. There's a path for them to follow. And it is the transcript, portions of the transcript, which we just read.
Yeah, the Hannity.
From Sean Hannity.
Yeah.
Sean Hannity to Roy Moore. Just read the transcript, senators, and make up your mind after you read that transcript.
You can't read that transcript without basically, given the way he's hedging on these questions.
Yes.
You can't help but, if you don't have to have covered cops for very long to look at that guy and say, that's a perp right there. That's not an innocent man. Bob, I want to come back to you, though, to come back to my, admittedly, obviously the political ramifications are not as important as the moral ramifications, but the political ramifications are real. We saw what happened to the Republican Party when they had a Todd Akin problem. The Todd Akin problem is dwarfed by the potential problem of Roy Moore for Republican candidates all over the country heading into 2018, where every one of them is going to be asked about Roy Moore if he ends up being, on a month from now, still being the Republican standard bearer in Alabama. Every Republican candidate is going to get this question. So just talk about the dimensions of that political problem for Republicans if they don't abandon this guy and quick.
It's a moment of choosing for both parties. Republicans, and especially President Trump, when he gets back from Asia, have to make a choice. On the Sunday shows, White House officials were hedging their comments, saying Moore has to have time to defend himself from the allegations. The president gave a similar comment when he was abroad. Are Republicans really going to stand by Moore? Not stand by Moore, but allow him to keep running if he refuses to quit the race? McConnell, of course, is taking a hard line. The White House is not. That's a choice they have to make. Democrats have to make a choice. Doug Jones, the prosecutor down there, running a very steady race, competitive in the polls. Are Democrats going to make a real play in the South? And what I'm watching as well, will any establishment Republicans, moderate Republicans, endorse Doug Jones? If they are so against Moore, how far are they willing to go in the coming weeks?
Heidi, a couple of Republicans in Washington, so obviously this strikes a nerve with most women, but they called me Friday afternoon after this show and said, what's the right thing to do? And I said, the right thing to do is either to run a write-in campaign for Luther Strange or get behind the Democrat. Is there any Kurt number 3 that I'm missing?
I don't think so, although I don't know that many Republicans are actually going to get behind the Democrat. But I think what you're going to see is more of them like Barbara Comstock, particularly Republican women, who I'm sure you were talking with over the weekend. Look, this wasn't just the story. It was Roy Moore's response to it, in which he essentially doesn't deny having had these relationships. He denies assaulting the women, but then he says, I never dated any of them without permission from their mother. Well, who needs permission from from their mother if you're another 30-year-old person. So it was his own response to this that was so problematic. And I also want to chime in, Nicole, on this from the perspective of the women that you were talking about earlier and the assault that they are coming under and why this is happening now. We saw the same thing in the Harvey Weinstein case. Why this is happening is because journalists, and might I also add, they are female journalists who went to these women and created this safe space for them to go ahead and tell their stories and to do it in a way that the evidence was so overwhelming. They corroborated also time and place. For example, with Lee Korfman, that she actually was at the courthouse for a child custody hearing at the time that this happened. So it is also the fact that these women are being given a safe space by other female journalists to come forward and tell their story, which is also what happened in the case of the Harvey Weinstein stories that were coming out.
You know, Nicole, John mentioned earlier that, you know, if you're a cop and you're interrogating Roy Moore the way Sean Hannity interrogated Roy Moore, if you have a guy like Roy Moore in the box, in the interrogation room, and he's talking as he spoke with Sean Hannity, you're thinking one thing looking across the table. Oh, there's more to come from this creep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There's just more to come.
And you know, you look at, just to pick up Heidi's point about Harvey Weinstein, what happened after the original New York Times and New Yorker reports were more women. What has happened, if it's not true, what happens in the aftermath of and it's an exquisite piece of journalism from the Washington Post, in that there are so many concurrent accounts. But what's happened since the story first was published on Thursday midday is more concurrent accounts from people that were peers of the women who were assaulted by Roy Moore.
And the women have stood by their story. They've been asked.
And the men and the women in their lives from that point on have stood by the stories and have added memories. And the pictures become more full, not more foggy, which is why the foggy account on Sean Hannity is a joke.
You know, and to go to just his last thing is on this, Bob Costa made the point. Democrats right now, you know, before this story broke, you had Howard Dean. There was a big argument after last Tuesday's elections. Should Democrats go and play in Alabama? The race was tight, be a huge victory for Democrats. Now this story has broken. If Democrats do not have the courage, it shouldn't even take that much courage right now to go down there and really run this race, get down there behind their candidate and try to take this race. It would be a huge symbolic victory on a million dimensions, both in terms of the gender politics, the politics of the South. It'd be a giant victory that would send a huge message across the country. Democrats have to seize that moment right now if they are going to try to, if they really think they have a chance to take back control of the Senate and the House. This is a moment to show that they have enough guts to go down there and throw some money and some energy into this race.
When the women grab back. Next hour, we'll go.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.
Day 295 of the Trump administration, and tonight it is now clear that the attention of Robert Mueller is, for the time being at least, bearing down on Mike Flynn, the retired U.S. Army general who was one of the stalwarts of the Trump campaign effort and who served as national security advisor for 24 days in the West Wing. NBC News reports today Mueller is investigating a possible deal between senior Turkish officials and Flynn during the presidential transition. This report says in part, quote, 4 people familiar with the investigation say Mueller is looking into whether Flynn discussed orchestrating the return to Turkey of a chief rival of Turkish President Erdogan, who lives in the U.S. Flynn was offered upwards of $15 million to be paid directly or indirectly if he could complete the deal, according to 2 sources familiar with the meeting. Flynn's lawyers released a statement about the story saying, quote, "We have intentionally avoided responding to every rumor or allegation raised in the media, but today's news cycle has brought allegations about General Flynn ranging from kidnapping to bribery that are so outrageous and prejudicial that we are making an exception to our usual rule. They are false." Flynn, you'll recall, among Trump's earliest campaign supporters. He served on the transition team before following the new president to the White House. Former acting Attorney General Sally Yates over at Justice had testified that 6 days after Trump took the oath of office, she warned the White House Flynn was compromised with the Russians. She also testified that Vice President Mike Pence had unknowingly made false statements about Flynn's conversations with the Russians. An administration official has said said Pence was relaying what Flynn told him. 18 days after Yates' warning, Trump fired Flynn. Here's how he explained why he did it.
Did you fire Mike Flynn?
Mike Flynn is a fine person, and I asked for his resignation. He respectfully gave it. He is a man who there was a certain amount of information given to Vice President Pence, who's with us today, and I was not happy with the way that information was given.
Did you direct Mike Flynn to discuss sanctions with the Russian ambassador
No, I didn't.
prior to your inauguration?
No, I didn't.
And would
Mike,
you have fired him if the
Excuse me.
information hadn't leaked out?
No, I fired him because of what he said to Mike Pence. Very simple. Mike was doing his job. He was calling countries and his counterparts. We ultimately fired, but we fired for a different reason.
You're talking about General Flynn?
General Flynn, yes.
Because of lying to the vice president?
Yeah, but everything plays in. Everything plays into it. But we fired him because he said something to the vice president that was not so.
Let's bring in our starting panel on a Friday night, shall we? NBC News national political reporter Julia Ainsley, who is one of the authors of that Flynn report we quoted. More on that in just a moment. Political White House reporter Matthew Nussbaum is back with us. And here with us in New York, Jennifer Rogers, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. Good evening and welcome to you all. Julia, you get to go first because of the panelists you made the news today. Tell us this story as best you can for a lay audience, including how in the name of God it also includes the Poconos in Pennsylvania?
That is a good question, and I will break that down for you as simply as I can. Basically, we know that Robert Mueller is looking into whether or not Michael Flynn and his associates met in a December 2016 meeting at the 21 Club in New York. That is an upscale restaurant just blocks away from the Trump Tower where Flynn was serving on the presidential transition team. We understand from sources who are familiar with this meeting that they allegedly talked about a $15 million bribe that they would try to give Flynn once he was national security advisor if he could see that Fethullah Gulen was removed from the United States. Gulen, of course, is a political opponent of Turkish President Erdogan. He's an elderly cleric living in the Poconos. In order to remove him, that could have been through a kidnapping operation or through extradition. We also know that the FBI had re-upped their investigation. They were asked to re-up their investigation into Gulen at the beginning of the Trump administration when Flynn served as national security advisor. This was after they had already dismissed this investigation under Obama. So we're looking at a number of pieces, but what Mueller is really trying to drill down on here is whether or not Michael Flynn, Trump's first national security advisor, was exploited to use his position in the U.S. government in order to serve the interests of another country, that country being Turkey.
And Julia, isn't it true that we also know about this meeting and the Turkish angle because a certain former CIA director came in and thought it didn't look or sound right to him, and he has since told that story?
So, Brian, that's actually two separate stories. The former CIA director, Woolsey, is referring to a September meeting. That was before the election when these Turkish officials talked to Michael Flynn about using his position just within his own lobbying firm, the Flynn Intel Group, and trying to orchestrate a forcible removal, possibly a kidnapping of Gulen. This meeting that we know about now actually happened during the transition when Flynn knew he would be becoming national security advisor later, and it may have involved a more legal route, such as an extradition. Of course, it is not normal, not appropriate routes for an extradition request to come from the White House. It's supposed to come through diplomatic channels in the Justice Department.
So, Counselor, this comes down to you. Someone said on social media today that if there could be anything funny taken out of this could be the plot from a Coen Brothers movie with General Flynn driving around the Poconos looking for this old guy to send out of the country. As a former prosecutor, what alarm bells go off in your head?
Well, it's not good for Flynn no matter how you slice it. If he's talking about taking money to try to orchestrate a return of Gulen to Turkey through official channels, then you're talking about serious bribery offenses. You're not allowed to take money to do things for your government job, right, except your salary. If you're talking about him trying to orchestrate some illegal operation. It's obviously a federal crime to orchestrate a kidnapping that crosses international lines. So either way you look at it, he's talking about committing a very serious crime if these allegations are proven to be true.
Matthew, how does this continue to haunt the administration that, after all, continues, even though the traveling White House right now is on the other side of the world?
In some ways, it's convenient that they're over there in Asia for now while this news drops, but Sarah Sanders and the rest will certainly have to confront this when they get back. And I think it would be hard to overstate just how serious this is. Obviously, the Manafort indictment was very serious for this White House, but that was someone who left the campaign in August. Mike Flynn is someone who was with the campaign through the end, was prominent on the transition, and served in this White House over the warnings of people like President Obama, who told President Trump not to hire him. And you have to remember, it was Michael Flynn who Donald Trump was defending to James Comey and said, hey, can't we find a way to let this go? He went on to later fire James Comey, which led to Bob Mueller getting here in the first place. This Flynn case is very, very serious for the White House, even more serious than the Manafort case.
And Matthew, let's go a little deeper on that, because this is more than just a news media distinction. Flynn does put it closer to the Oval Office of a sitting president than anyone else. People may have seen splashy headlines about Paul Manafort and others, but this would put it in a different category.
That's right. At the end of the day, as important as Paul Manafort was in this campaign, he was the campaign chairman. He was helping to lead a political campaign. What we're seeing with Flynn, with these allegations, is possibly using his government office, his position as the national security advisor, to be basically doing deeds on behalf of a foreign government. It's a question of who in the White House knew about this. We know that Flynn allegedly misled the vice president, but having this so close to the Oval Office, and then again, having the president himself ask the FBI director to back away from this investigation, that raises so many red flags, and obviously Bob Mueller is digging into that.
Julia, assisting the prosecution, as often is the case, there is a grand jury sitting in Washington, D.C. You've learned further about their schedule of late. What can you report about that?
Yes, that's right, Brian. So we know that the grand jury that's been impaneled by Robert Mueller will be interviewing witnesses about Flynn's lobbying activities through the end of next week. That's important because a lot of people have been waiting for a Flynn indictment for some time. Since the Manafort indictment, we've thought that Flynn would be the next shoe to drop. We know that Mueller is continuing these interviews, which shows us two things. One is that he really wants to drill deep and get as much information on Flynn as he possibly can. And it also shows that Flynn perhaps could be cooperating, and that's why this timeline has been extended.
Counselor, I want to hear you out on a piece in Time magazine written by the former assistant director of counterintelligence for Mueller while at the FBI, Robert Anderson. The headline is How Robert Mueller Works a Case, and here's a quote from it in part. When you talk about people who are used to spending nearly $1 million in 3 years on business suits out of a place in Cyprus, these guys are not going to do 25 years in jail. That's why Bob Mueller's going about this the way that he is. He knows these guys are not seasoned criminals, and he knows they're going to roll over on each other. Mark my words, it'll start becoming a race to the special counsel's office. I also heard someone today refer to Mueller as an acupuncturist for the precision with which they've gone about the case so far. Your reaction?
Well, that's the idea, clearly. I mean, that was, I think, the point behind the substance and the heft of the Manafort and Gates indictment was to get them to cooperate. And similarly here, they have charges that they could bring on Flynn already, but the registration, the Foreign Agents Registration Act offense and a false statements offense is not maybe enough to get him to flip. So you bring, potentially, if they can, these charges, which are significantly more serious. And Flynn already, unlike Manafort, has indicated an interest in getting immunity and perhaps cooperating. So I think they think if they can get a serious enough offense against Flynn, then he's definitely flipping.
Do you concur with what seems to be the present attitude that we know between 1% and 10% of what's going on? For all our fancy reporting and all the talking we devote to this, Mueller runs a very tight ship.
I think that's right. I mean, and that's the way it should be, honestly. I mean, these are confidential investigations that are going on, and until they bring actions that are meant to be public, then I agree that they should stay confidential, despite the great work of the news media. But I think we have a lot to learn still, and hopefully they will be able to do their work, and we'll find it out when it's time.
And Matt, let's just delve briefly into the Trump agenda. While all this is going on, we're hearing a lot about tax cuts and tax reform, and soon the traveling circus is going to come back to town, and we're going to be all about Capitol Hill once again.
That's right. I mean, we know this administration has a hard time driving one message. We've seen that this week when tax reform and the Asia trip were supposed to be the big thing. Obviously, Roy Moore made short work of that. Between this controversy down in Alabama and the White House having to answer for that, and Mueller's investigation expanding, and these new questions about Flynn, you couple that with the fact that this tax bill looks like it actually raises taxes on a fair amount of middle-class families. That's a lot of issues for the White House to be coming back to, and this is not an environment that's friendly to something as complex and politically difficult as tax reform.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.
Today, the National Republican Senatorial Committee announced it's severing its fundraising relationship with Roy Moore for the special election to an Alabama Senate seat on December 12th because of a 14-year-old girl and a 16-year-old girl and a 17-year-old girl and an 18-year-old girl with whom Roy Moore had inappropriate contact when he was a 32-year-old assistant district attorney, according to a report in the Washington Post based on interviews with over 30 sources in Alabama. Roy Moore let 24 hours pass in the face of these accusations before finally raising his voice in his defense today, but he still did not dare to show his face. And so he presented himself to the safest possible forum in America to make his case, Sean Hannity's radio show, where Sean Hannity asked Roy Moore a series of leading questions that he never would have been allowed to ask if he was Roy Moore's defense lawyer in a courtroom. Sean Hannity tried to help Roy Moore in every way he possibly could, but as lawyers who represent guilty clients can tell you, he couldn't get the sound of guilty out of Roy Moore's voice. Roy Moore denied a statutory rape allegation made by Lee Korfman about what Roy Moore did to her when she was 14 years old. In response to Roy Moore's denial, Lee Korfman gave a statement to a local news affiliate in Alabama today, stating, "I stand by my comments. The article is very detailed. Anyone with questions should please reread it. And I want to say thank you to my friends and others who have supported me and my story." And so we will reread some of those accusations. Lee Korfman's mother supported her story of meeting Roy Moore in the courthouse where Roy Moore was an assistant district attorney. The Washington Post reports he struck up a conversation with Korfman and her mother, and offered to watch the girl while her mother went inside for a child custody hearing. He said, "Oh, you don't want her to go in there and hear all that. I'll stay out here with her," says Korfman's mother, Nancy Wells, 71. "I thought, how nice for him to want to take care of my little girl." According to the Washington Post report, Roy Moore had other plans for her little girl. He called her on the phone, set up a date with a 14-year-old girl, arranged a place to pick her up where her mother wouldn't know, and drove her 30 minutes to his home in the woods. Lee Korfman told the Washington Post, quote, that before long, she was lying on a blanket on the floor. She remembers Moore disappearing into another room and coming out with nothing on but tight white underwear. She remembers that Moore kissed her, that he took off her pants and shirt, and that he touched her through her bra and underpants. She says that he guided her hand to his underwear and that she yanked her hand back. "I wasn't ready for that. I had never put my hand on a man's penis, much less an erect one," Korfman says. She remembers thinking, "I don't want to do this, and I need to get out of here." Every bit of Roy Moore's behavior that day with Lee Korfman was a felony punishable by at least 10 years in prison, and that is what Roy Moore denies. Roy Moore claimed today that the Washington Post is completely biased against him, as it is biased against President Trump, and that's why they wrote this article with that lie. But then, in the very same interview, Roy Moore used that very same article to prove that he was a good guy. He used the stories about the other little girls told in that very same article to prove that he is a good guy.
It's a direct attack on this campaign, and it involves a 14-year-old girl, which I would have never had any contact with, nothing with her mother or in a courthouse or anywhere else would I have done that. In fact, her allegations contradict the whole behavior pattern that the two of the young ladies even witnessed herself.
So there he is saying that the behavior pattern described by the other two teenage girls in the very same article was accurate. He wants you to believe that the other two teenage girls, and he doesn't want you to believe the 14-year-old girl who has accused him, in effect, of sexual assault and statutory rape. Okay. Here are the stories Roy Moore wants you to believe. Wendy Miller says she was 14 and working as a Santa's helper at the Gadsden Mall when Moore first approached her, and 16 when he asked her on dates, which her mother forbade. So he wants you to believe that he asked a 16-year-old on dates and that he's a nice guy because he gave up when her mother said no. Roy Moore thinks that's a nice story about a good guy in Alabama in 1979. Roy Moore wants you to believe Debbie Gibson. She was 17 when Roy Moore spoke to her high school civics class. He met her in her civics class in high school when he was speaking to the class, and he asked her out on dates. And he had several dates with the girl, 32-year-old prosecutor, the girl he met in her high school civics class. And he's very proud that the Washington Post reports that those dates did not go beyond kissing, that there was no sex on those dates, according to the Washington Post. Debbie Gibson said that Roy Moore took her to his house, read her poetry, and played guitar. The same house where the Washington Post says he assaulted Lee Korfman. Roy Moore wants you to believe the account of the 17-year-old girl dating the 32-year-old district attorney. Gloria Deason was an 18-year-old cheerleader when Roy Moore began taking her on dates that included wine. The legal drinking age in Alabama at the time was 19. They met at the mall, too. Gloria Deason says that they never had sex when she was 18 years old, dating the 32-year-old prosecutor. And Roy Moore believes that that story means that he was a good guy. That's the whole behavior pattern you just heard Roy Moore talk about. Now let's listen to the part one more time where Roy Moore is using the other girls in the story to prove that the 14-year-old is not telling the truth.
In fact, her allegations contradict the whole behavior pattern that the two of the young ladies even witnessed herself.
And that is Roy Moore pleading guilty to the 3 accusations of trying to date and dating teenage girls when he was 32 years old. A 16-year-old whose mother was there to protect her daughter from Roy Moore. A 17-year-old he met in her high school civics class, and an 18-year-old cheerleader. That's his defense, that those girls are telling the truth about Roy Moore, because they say he did not have sex with them. That's the truth. That's what he says is the truth. That was a very, very incriminating answer. Roy Moore said that he didn't remember speaking at Debbie's civics class, but he did say that he knew her. So naturally, Sean Hannity asked if he remembered going out on dates with her.
I don't remember specific dates. No, I do not. And I don't remember if it was that time or later, but I do not remember that, no.
But you know her, but you never dated her ever. Is that what you're saying?
Know her, but I don't remember going out on dates. I knew her as a friend. If we did go out on dates, then we did, but I do not remember that.
In a courtroom, if you said you don't remember if we did go out on dates when you're talking about the little girl you met in civics class when you were 32 years old, there is not a jury in America that's going to believe that you did not go out on dates. There is no man in the world who would not remember speaking to a high school civics class at age 32 and then going out on dates with one of the girls in that high school civics class. If we did go out on dates, then we did. That's his testimony. Then Sean Hannity turned to the general idea of a 32-year-old guy dating teenage girls.
Would it be unusual for you as a 32-year-old guy to have dated a woman as young as 17? That would be a, 15-year difference, or a girl 18. Do you remember dating girls that young at that time?
Not generally, no. If I did, I'm not going to dispute anything, but I don't remember anything like that.
But you don't specifically remember having any girlfriend that was in her late teens even at that time?
No, I don't remember that, and I don't remember ever dating any girl without the permission of her mother.
And then Sean Hannity had to go to a commercial, or in a courtroom, what they would have called a recess. And during the commercial, Sean Hannity clearly realized there was a serious problem for Roy Moore that just developed in that interview, that Roy Moore did not deny dating teenage girls when he was 32. And so after the commercial, this happened.
If you're 32 and you do date, again, there's a difference, 17 or 18-year-old, that's a pretty big gap for a pretty young girl. Is that something you did when you were dating? I'm not talking about the 14-year-old in that specific allegation. Would it be normal behavior back in those days for you to date a girl that's 17 or 18?
No, not normal.
If my daughter is 17, my daughter's 16 years old. If she's 17 or 18, I don't want her dating a 32-year-old.
I wouldn't either.
And you can say unequivocally you never dated anybody that was in their late teens like that when you were 32?
It would have been out of my customary behavior. That's right.
Out of my customary behavior. There's Sean Hannity doing everything he possibly can to guide Roy Moore to the correct answer, and he can't get him there. Can you say unequivocally that you didn't date anybody that was in their late teens like that when you were 32? And Roy Moore says, out of my customary behavior. That is a very different answer, a very different phrase from the word never. Sean Hannity knew exactly how deep a hole Roy Moore had dug for himself, and so he gave it one more try, and he tried to put the right words into Roy Moore's mouth in a way that would never be allowed in a courtroom. And those were the words that Roy Moore had not yet said.
In other words, you don't recall ever dating any girl that young when you were that old?
I've said no.
And you think that's inappropriate, too? That's what you're saying?
Inappropriate, yes.
And so the best Roy Moore's defense lawyer could get him to say today is that he does not recall dating any girl that young when he was that old. Does not recall. That is the Roy Moore defense. That was enough for Republican Senator Mike Lee, who tweeted this. Having read the detailed description of the incidents as well as the response from Judge Moore and his campaign, I can no longer endorse his candidacy for the U.S. Senate. And so Sean Hannity established today that he believes that if Roy Moore dated a 14-year-old when he was an assistant district attorney, that he is unfit to be a Senate candidate. And he got Roy Moore to agree with that principle. And the best Roy Moore could say is that I don't recall when it came to the question of dating teenage girls that Sean Hannity said would make him unfit for the United States Senate. I don't recall. The Washington Post reported a set of accusations that were very clear and very detailed, and Roy Moore has denied the most important and the most criminal of those accusations, the one with the most severe penalty. And then, in most of his interview today, he agreed to the other accusations, that he tried to date and date some of those teenage girls, but then finally left Sean Hannity with the contradiction of his own testimony when he said to Sean Hannity that he did not recall dating those teenage girls after saying that he did date those teenage girls. That was good enough for Sean Hannity. It was okay. He accepted that. And that is good enough for the President of the United States, who is a self-confessed sexual assaulter. And it is so far, as of tonight, good enough for the Majority Leader of the United States Senate, Mitch McConnell, who invited Roy Moore into the Senate, into a meeting with all of the Republican members of the Senate, and sat down with him and said, how can we help you? What can we do to help you get elected? And not one of those senators, and not Mitch McConnell, is dragging him back in and to say, what did you do with that 14-year-old girl? Not one of them. But with this very specific, sharply drawn set of allegations by women coming forward to tell their stories, I don't recall, is not good enough in the court of public opinion. It is not good enough in the court of basic human decency. Not good enough.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.
Welcome back to On Assignment. President Trump is used to being a divisive figure. He's even used to low approval numbers. But here in South Korea, his numbers are especially harsh. Only 17% of those asked in a recent poll said they had confidence in him. That's a 71-point drop from Obama standing here. Of course, South Koreans don't get a vote on who becomes the president of the United States, but they do have strong opinions on that. Opinions they aired the day President Trump landed here. When President Trump rolled into Seoul, crowds lined the streets. Many were here to welcome the president with open arms, American flags, and a rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn early night?
Traditionally, South Koreans have welcomed Americans, servicemen and presidents alike, warmly.
We believe United States, and we love United States.
But things are changing here. Just across the street, we found another equally passionate crowd. They were here to tell the American president to go home. Police officers cordoned off the protesters who tried to surge forward. President Trump is expected to pass by here any minute. The police have just started to push in, trying to keep the protesters back. They don't want them to block the president's path. But things soon calmed down again. This was not a violent crowd. You're holding a sign? What does it say?
It says, peace, not war.
Peace, not war.
Yeah.
Soo-Yeon Jung is 29 years old. She's one of the leaders of the protest.
In here, there are lots of students, university students, who doesn't want Donald Trump visiting Korea.
The divide is striking. Those waving the American flags are generally older. Those holding up the "No Trump, no war" signs tend to be much younger.
The younger generation here, they're not so interested in North Korea because they haven't grown up with it in their lives. Older generation, they remember when it was just Korea or the Japanese colonial era, for example. So they have more of a direct sense of, there was one country and now we're divided.
Daniel Tudor came here as a teacher, but fell in love with South Korea. He now runs a chain of bars that serve craft beer. He says for the older generation, there is a sense of unfinished business with North Korea.
I think probably for that generation, if you're of that age, you might think, well, why don't we just get this done? In my lifetime, I want to see this over, regardless of what happens.
The memory of the bitter war between North and South defines the Korean Peninsula in a profound way. No one here disputes the fact that it was a massive influx of U.S. troops that saved South Korea from falling into communist hands. For generations, gratitude for that and for the protection that U.S. troops still stationed here 64 years after the end of the fighting defined this country not anymore. By nightfall, the number of anti-Trump protesters swelled. Soo-yeon and her fellow protesters had watched the president's speech on their phones. This is, after all, South Korea. Everything here is streamed live.
USA!
On the pro-American side of the street,
Mr. Trump!
the feeling was that, if anything, the president should have gone further.
We strongly demand, request Mr. Donald Trump, please strike North Korea right now. He's thinking about our casualty, but I want to say to him, don't worry, please don't worry, Koreans. We are ready to sacrifice our lives.
Chae Tae-sun was a lieutenant colonel in the South Korean army. His stance is stoic and simple. Better dead than red. So you're willing to accept the huge costs that a war would cause?
And sacrifice. I may die, which will be fine. Just kill the North Korean Kim Jong-un.
The feeling across the other side of the street was entirely different. Why is he allowed to speak at our parliament? Shouted Soo-yeon. No Trump, no war. By day, Soo-yeon works as a pharmacist. In Korea, it takes 4 years of medical school on top of a good college education to qualify for the job. She's worked hard to get here, but when we sat down to talk, she sounded downbeat about her future.
We can think about our future. Hey, think about it. If there's we keep our money or we keep our job, we do lots of things for our future, we study hard. But eventually, if there's a war happen, it's nothing.
It all goes away.
We can't imagine our future.
It's a historical irony that the younger generations here who grew up in modern Seoul, one of the richest cities in Asia, are bitter about their future.
I think we lost our own independent power at the global table.
How does that feel?
If Kim Jong-un or Trump decided to make war in Korean Peninsula, there's nothing we can do. It's a crazy thing.
It's not something that you think about, day to day. But yeah, it's always there.
Do they feel like the shadow of death is hanging over them?
If it really happens, I'll be dead in 5 minutes, so it's better to not think about it.
Okay. When Soo-yeon and her friends go out, they don't talk about politics or war. They talk about friends and plans and work. Do you prepare for potential conflict?
Actually, I don't, because if there's a war, it's gonna be a minute or 2 minutes that I have to. There's no option to be alive. It's like we just live only today.
Live in the moment.
No tomorrow for us. We only have this moment.
So when I go out in the street and I see the places happy and buzzing.
Yeah, that's why. We always having concert and go to movies or love each other, but we only concerned about today. That's why, because we're not sure about tomorrow.
One thing everyone we talked to agreed on is that there may be two Koreas, but one people. They long for the day when they can be reunited with their neighbors and relatives on the other side of the border. But the people of North Korea don't get a vote. Only their leader does, Kim Jong-un. So next, we try to figure out what he is all about and why his regime's pursuit of nuclear power may not be as foolish as it sounds. It's easy to dismiss the regime as a caricature. The bad guys in the Team America movie.
I don't have any weapons of mass destruction, okay, Hans?
But it's worth looking past the bizarre cult of personality and the goose-stepping troops and trying to actually understand what the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, might be thinking. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.